You're standing in an open field, wearing nothing but leather and metal, while the sky above you turns black. Not from clouds, from arrows, thousands of them, screaming toward you at lethal speed. Every instinct in your body is telling you to run, to scatter, to find cover. But you don't. Instead, you hear a single word barked by your commander, and suddenly, you disappear. You and hundreds of men around you vanish beneath a shell of wood and iron so tight that not even light passes through. The arrows come. They strike. They bounce off harmlessly. You're invisible. You're untouchable. You've become something that isn't quite human anymore. You've become a war machine. What you just witnessed wasn't science fiction. It was real. It happened over 2,000 years ago on blood-soaked battlefields across 3 continents. And today, you're about to discover exactly how ordinary men transformed themselves into an unstoppable fortress of flesh and steel. The Romans didn't invent war, but they perfected it. And one of their most terrifying innovations was a formation so effective, so brutally efficient, that enemies would literally freeze in fear when they saw it deployed. They called it the Testudo. In Latin, that word means one thing: tortoise. And once you understand how it worked, you'll realize the name is disturbingly perfect. Imagine a tortoise pulling its head and limbs inside its shell when danger approaches. Now imagine that tortoise is made of 36 armed killers, each one willing to die for the man next to him. Each one trained since childhood to move, breathe, and think as a single organism. That's what the Testudo was. Not a group of soldiers. A living, breathing, walking tank made entirely of human beings. But here's what most people don't understand. The Testudo wasn't designed for attacking. It wasn't meant to charge into enemy lines and break them apart. No, its purpose was far more sinister. It was designed for one specific, terrifying scenario: advancing slowly, methodically, inevitably toward enemy walls during a siege while the sky rained death. Think about that for a second. You're a defender standing on top of massive stone walls. You have the high ground. You have unlimited arrows, spears, rocks, boiling oil, everything you need to stop an advancing army. And yet, here they come, step by step, unstoppable. You fire everything you have. Nothing works. They just keep coming. Closer, closer, until they're at your gates. And by then, it's already too late. That psychological warfare was just as devastating as the physical protection the formation provided. But the Testudo didn't just appear out of nowhere. It required something very specific, something that took Roman military engineers decades to perfect. Let's talk about shields. Before the 4th century BC, Roman soldiers fought like everyone else in the ancient world. They used a formation called the phalanx, borrowed from the Greeks. And their shields? Round, large, convex. They called it the clypeus. It looked impressive. It worked, sort of. But it had a fatal flaw. When you line up soldiers carrying round shields, something unavoidable happens: gaps. No matter how tightly you pack them together, the curved edges create spaces, weak points, places where arrows, spears, and swords can slip through. And in ancient warfare, táctica gaps meant death. Then something changed. Rome shifted its entire tactical doctrine. They abandoned the rigid phalanx and adopted something more flexible, the manipular formation. And with that change came a new shield, the scutum. This wasn't just an upgrade. It was a revolution. The scutum was rectangular, tall, curved to fit the body. It covered a soldier from shoulder to knee, protecting nearly everything vital. But here's the genius part. Because it was rectangular with straight edges, soldiers could lock their shields together with zero gaps. Perfect alignment, perfect coverage, side by side, top to bottom. A seamless wall of wood, leather, and iron. That geometric precision is what made the Testudo possible. Without the scutum, the formation would have been suicide. With it, Roman infantry became nearly invincible under the right conditions. Now, let's talk about how they actually executed this nightmare. Executing the Testudo wasn't just about holding up a shield. It required absolute trust, flawless timing, and the kind of discipline that only comes from relentless training. One mistake, one hesitation, one soldier out of sync, and the entire formation could collapse. And collapse meant death. A standard Testudo formation often consisted of 27 men, though the number could vary depending on the tactical situation. But regardless of size, the structure followed the same brutal logic. First, the front line. The soldiers in the first row held their shields vertically, covering their bodies from shin to eye level. These men became the face of the beast. The wall, the thing the enemy saw advancing toward them, slow and unstoppable. Second, the roof. This is where it gets insane. The soldiers in the rows behind the front line didn't hold their shields in front of them. They raised them overhead, horizontal, flat, creating a literal ceiling above the formation. But they didn't just hold them up with brute strength. Their arms would give out in seconds. Instead, they rested the shields on top of their helmets. Weight distribution, engineering, genius. But it gets better. Those overhead shields weren't placed randomly. They were overlapped, layered, like roof tiles. This wasn't just for coverage. It was so arrows would slide off harmlessly instead of getting stuck or punching through. Every detail mattered, every angle calculated. Third, the flanks and rear. Soldiers on the sides of the formation turned outward, shields facing left and right, sealing the edges. In some situations, especially if the unit was isolated or surrounded, soldiers in the back row would turn completely around, shields facing backward, creating a fully enclosed box, a mobile fortress with no weak points. Inside that shell, soldiers marched shoulder to shoulder, sometimes literally touching. The formation was so tight, so compact, that there was barely room to breathe. But that compression was intentional. It made them stronger, unbreakable. And the results? Absolutely terrifying. One of the most vivid accounts comes from Plutarch, a Greek historian who documented Roman campaigns with disturbing detail. He describes a moment during General Mark Antony's disastrous invasion of the Parthian Empire in 36 BC. The Roman forces were descending steep hills when suddenly the Parthian archers opened fire. Thousands of arrows, a black cloud of death. Plutarch writes that the Romans immediately formed the Testudo. Soldiers carrying lighter armor were pulled into the center. The outer ranks dropped to one knee, shields locked, and in seconds, the entire unit vanished beneath what Plutarch called a roof of shields. He describes it as a spectacle, a marvel. Arrows struck the formation and simply glanced off, sliding away harmlessly. But here's where it gets brilliant. The Parthians, seeing Roman soldiers on their knees, assumed they were exhausted, weak, so they dropped their bows and charged in for close combat. Fatal mistake. The Romans exploded upward with a war cry, spears and swords already in motion, and tore the Parthian force apart. Another historian, Cassius Dio, describes the same campaign and adds an almost unbelievable detail. He says the Testudo was so tightly constructed, so dense, that men could walk on top of it. Not figuratively, literally. Soldiers could step onto the roof of shields and move across the formation. And when the army encountered narrow ravines or ditches, they used the testudo as a bridge. Horses, carts, entire supply wagons rolled across the backs of men holding shields overhead. Let that sink in. A human bridge, strong enough to support cavalry. Tacitus, another Roman historian, records the use of the testudo during the brutal siege of Cremona under the command of Vespasian's forces. He describes soldiers advancing toward the city walls under a dense roof of shields, moving through a hellstorm of projectiles without breaking formation. Relentless, inevitable, unstoppable. But now here's the part they don't tell you in the history books, the part that gets left out of the legends. The testudo wasn't invincible, not even close. It was a tool, a highly specialized tool. And like all tools, it had weaknesses. Brutal, exploitable weaknesses. First, speed, or rather the complete lack of it. Moving in a testudo was agonizingly slow. Every step had to be synchronized, every shield perfectly aligned. Add in the weight of armor, weapons, and the shields themselves, and you have soldiers burning energy at an insane rate. Exhaustion set in fast, and exhausted soldiers make mistakes. Second, visibility. Once you're inside that shell, you're blind. You can barely see 2 feet in front of you. You're relying entirely on the man next to you, the commander's voice, and pure faith that the formation is holding. If the enemy flanks you, if they attack from an unexpected angle, you won't see it coming until it's too late. Third, mobility in combat. The testudo was a defensive formation, emphasis on defensive. If you're locked into it and the enemy rushes you with swords, spears, or worse, you can't fight back effectively. You can't swing a weapon. You can't maneuver. You're a sitting target. And fourth, unconventional weapons. This is where things get horrifying. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus recounts a siege at Jotapata, where Roman forces deployed a testudo to advance on the city walls. The defenders, desperate and clever, came up with a solution. They heated massive quantities of animal fat and oil until it was boiling. She then poured it over the edge of the wall directly onto the testudo below. The oil was too hot, too liquid. It seeped through the cracks between shields. It ran down onto helmets, arms, faces. Soldiers screamed. The formation shattered. Men scrambled, trying to escape the burning agony. And once the testudo broke apart, the defenders rained down arrows and stones, slaughtering them in the open. But perhaps the most catastrophic failure of the testudo, and Roman infantry tactics in general, happened at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC. This wasn't just a defeat, it was annihilation. The Roman general Crassus led 7 legions into Parthian territory, confident in Roman superiority. But the Parthians had a strategy the Romans had never faced before: combined arms warfare on horseback. Horse archers who could fire while riding at full speed, uari and heavily armored cataphracts, shock cavalry designed to smash through infantry lines. Here's the nightmare scenario the Romans faced. If they opened their ranks to avoid being trampled by cataphracts, the horse archers would shred them with arrows. If they closed ranks and formed the testudo to protect against arrows, the cataphracts would charge straight into the compressed formation, crushing soldiers under the weight of armored horses and lances. Damned if you do. Dead if you don't. Cassius Dio describes the Roman dilemma perfectly. Every tactical choice led to death. They were trapped in a tactical paradox with no escape. Crassus and most of his army were destroyed. It remains one of the worst military disasters in Roman history. And yet, despite its flaws, despite its vulnerabilities, despite the catastrophic failures, so the Testudo worked. It saved countless lives. It won sieges. It terrified enemies. And its legacy didn't die with Rome. Centuries later, during the medieval period, armies across Europe and the Middle East began using almost identical formations. Arab forces in the 8th century deployed a tactic called the dababa, meaning crawler, using interlocked shields during sieges in North Africa. Frankish soldiers under Charlemagne around 800 AD used overhead shield formations to protect engineers. Vikings during the siege of Paris in 885 AD formed shield roofs to advance on fortifications. Crusaders at the siege of Nicaea in 1097 AD revived the exact same tactic, consciously or not. The machine of Rome collapsed. The empire crumbled. But the ideas, the discipline, the brilliance of formations like the Testudo lived on for 1,000 years. So here's the question I want you to think about. Could you do it? Could you stand shoulder to shoulder with strangers, hold a 15-pound shield over your head while arrows scream down? Trust that the man next to you won't break, won't run, won't let you die. Could you march forward, step by agonizing step, knowing that one mistake, one gap in the shell, means you're dead? That's what it took to be a Roman legionary. Not just strength, not just skill. Absolute, unwavering trust in the men around you. Because in the Testudo, you didn't survive alone. You survived together. Or you died together. If this deep dive into ancient military tactics got your blood pumping, do me a favor, smash that like button, subscribe if you want more history that hits different, and drop a comment below. Tell me, would you have the guts to march in a Testudo? Or would you break the moment the arrows started flying? I want to know. And hey, there's another video waiting for you right now. Something just as intense, just as brutal. Click it. Let's keep going.